Well, I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Caitlin Mcconnell, a Senior Associate at Clayton Utz, who specialises in agricultural legislation, environmental markets and climate change litigation. Caitlin's endeavours are as impactful and wide-reaching as her networks. As a sixth-generation farmer and lawyer, Caitlin passionately advocates for meaningful and sustainable changes to our food systems at all levels in Australia, to be climate neutral and provide long-term food security for all. Now, she's been influencing in this space for the past decade and shaping the legal landscape of agriculture, water, sustainability and climate change, while also remaining grounded as she elevates awareness of the importance of mental health and wellness on communities. So please join me in welcoming Caitlin.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are meeting today by paying my respect to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Given the indisputable link between land, culture and food, I would also like to acknowledge the rich and affectionate intergenerational history that my family have with the Dungaburra people, now led by our elder May Masters, on the land we continue to live and farm alongside each other in southeast Queensland. As a primary producer in a nation striving to make agriculture a $100 billion industry, I'm the first to acknowledge that using the term food insecurity in the context of Australia often sparks more reaction than just the slight cock of an eyebrow. Until about 5 years ago, a reference to food insecurity would have me recalling the images we so often see in World Vision footage of third world countries in extreme poverty. Food in Australia was, and still is, a recognisable foundation of our culture, our economy, and our relationship with the natural world, in keeping not only with this recent quote by the UN Secretary General, but also so often depicted through imagery of abundant harvests and tables laden with nostalgia-inducing feasts. But the romanticism of abundance in Australia has lost its shine for me of late, with my mind now conjuring imagery reflective of the fact that 1 in 6 Australians suffer a level of food insecurity weekly. And the demand for food relief in Australia has led to the emergency food relief system now being referred to an industry in itself. I'll admit that I'm now often on the receiving end of raised eyebrows, and not just from fellow primary producers, when I share the little-known fact that the UN has actually identified Australia as a country maintaining a level of food insecurity since 2018 because of the effect natural disasters have on agricultural production and the breakdown of food systems. But fortuitously, the questionable eyebrow is now turning to a curious head tilt when I suggest the issue of food security transcends agricultural productivity, and that the foundations for achieving a common objective of food security have actually been available to us all for nearly 30 years. Food security was defined in the Rome Declaration on World Food Security in 1996 as being achieved when all people, at all times, have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Australia adopted this declaration and the associated World Food Summit Plan of Action, which set out several commitments and objectives for UN member states to lay the foundations for diverse paths to the common objective for food security. This includes that Australia would ensure an enabling political, social and economic environment designed to create the best conditions for achieving sustainable food security, implement policies to ensure that food supplies are safe, physically and economically accessible, appropriate and adequate to meet the energy and nutrient needs of the population, develop policies and practices that take decisive action in cooperation between the public and private spheres, endeavour to prevent and be prepared for natural disasters and man-made emergencies, and strive to clarify the content of the right to adequate food and the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. Whilst there remains no universal consensus on how the interactions between food, nutrition, human health, and agri-governmental sustainability should be framed, the UN Secretary-General recently opined that the food system does not thrive without all industry sectors working as one, and that a systems approach involving government, business, and citizens must be taken for the development of national mechanisms that respect the human right to food and contributes to people's nutrition, health, and well-being, restore and protect nature, are climate neutral, adapted to local circumstances, and provide decent jobs and inclusive economies. Now, although Australia reaffirmed the Rome Declaration in 1996, we have not, at law, formally recognised the right to food as a fundamental human right, notwithstanding previous calls from independent statutory bodies, including the Australian Institute of Family Studies. And despite our increasing awareness that food insecurity rarely occurs in isolation, we continue to see the implementation of responses to food insecurity within silos of industry or government portfolios, the majority of which are primarily grounded on food availability, accessibility, and agricultural productivity. So how do I think that we can take a holistic approach to addressing the underlying multi-dimensional drivers of food crisis, including environmental, political, economic, society, and security risk? By starting with a new definition of food security that is more reflective of the intrinsically complex nature of this issue. And I'd like to express my gratitude that it is in fact my definition, which I shared on a podcast earlier this year that led to my introduction to Sarah and the team at Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales, who I'm honoured to have used my definition as just one of the guides they've used to inform their very own definition, which you've been asked to consider at this symposium today. You'll see that I've included my definition in an umbrella to signify the reality that food security impacts every single aspect of our lives, and crucially, every Commonwealth ministerial portfolio in Australia, and not just the usual suspects such as agriculture or regional development. Food security is irrefutably linked to all portfolios, including the Attorney General's Department, which, as Craig touched on this morning, is responsible for maintaining and improving Australia's law and justice framework. The Department of Defence, whose operations branch is often deployed to assist with food relief during national emergencies. The Department of Education, which I was interested to read, made a commitment to invest $4 billion from 2018 to 2029 into critical research, including the capacity to address food security in circumstances where it can affect children's school readiness, academic achievement, and school attendance. The Department of Finance, which helps to find the buckets of money required to provide reactive measures to food insecurity, such as the provision of food, materials, and equipment used during emergency management. We've spoken about the Department of Health today, which recognises that food insecurity negatively impacts physical, mental, and social health of all individuals through instances of diet-related illnesses. And finally, the Department of Home Affairs, which, through a Senate inquiry in 2018, recognised that food and water insecurity has significant threats to Australia's national security through increased instances of geopolitical tensions, forced migration, and international aggressive suppression strategies. To bring all the seemingly fragmented approaches to food security in Australia under one framework, I've used my proposed definition before the recent federal government inquiry to recommend how a national food security strategy could be developed to not only recognise the fundamental role food and water security play in long-term economic sustainable development, but to mandatorily inform the development of long-term economic strategies, plans, and policies. To do this, I believe that the Australian Government, through its Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, should appoint an independent reviewer to consider and give findings on Australia's food system by considering existing policies and frameworks relating to food security. It should draft a national strategy that recognises food as a fundamental human right, and should also consider the long-term management and regulation of food security in Australia. Now, I acknowledge that this recommendation goes against Levi's comments earlier today, but I consider that this proposed review would drive change and not simply reinvent the wheel. That is in circumstances where there is an extraordinary depth and breadth of existing and growing policies, reports and recommendations on issues pertaining to food security in Australia, which is demonstrative of the disconnected and siloed approach the issue has been taken to date. These existing materials are critical, but have never been considered cumulatively to ensure that recommendations or initiatives meet the needs of every single person in Australia. I believe that a review of this nature would be the very last we would need to do in respect of food security in Australia, and it would ensure that we mitigate the costs and resources required to drive courageous change. It would ascertain whether the implementation of existing laws and policy or frameworks on food security are actually effective, and ensure that a national strategy actively gathers multiple sectors of government, industry and business, many of whom we all know have already spent considerable time and effort on this issue. In keeping with independent reviews recently undertaken by the United Kingdom and Canada, I've recommended that an external consultant be appointed to provide a safe and multi-partisan space. But I've also gone one step further by recommending that that appointment and that independent reviewer should have experience in law as a practicing lawyer, specifically statutory interpretation, in circumstances where lawyers have a paramount duty to the court and the administration of justice, and a duty to avoid any compromise to their integrity and professional independence. And I believe that individual should also have experience or a working familiarity with the complementary industries of this area, including agriculture, energy and resources, and water, just to name a few. My view is that these additional qualifications would ensure that Australia is satisfying not only the international affirmations and commitments it has already made in respect to food security, but potentially circumvent some of the negative feedback received following the independent reviews in Canada and the UK. Now, you'll also see that I consider the establishment of an independent advisory board, which should be external to government, and I believe it's paramount that this be implemented to assist and inform the independent reviewer by collating and giving first-hand feedback on the effectiveness of existing policies we have here in Australia, as well as the content of any proposed strategy, as well as determine whether or not an independent statutory office would actually ensure that we don't set and forget a national strategy and end up having this very conversation in 5 or 10 years' time. To be truly reflective of diversity in Australia, I believe the board should be made up of individuals who have experience in business and communities that are linked to the objectives and focus of every ministerial portfolio. So how do I believe a strategy would be different from what we've seen before? Through a clear purpose enshrined in law, that the development of all long-term economic strategies, plans and policies across all levels of government must mandatorily have regard to the fundamental human right to food. To do this, I've recommended that the UN Sustainable Development Goals should be used as a guide in circumstances where food systems are recognised as playing a key role in achieving multiple SDGs. The strategy must have regard to the fundamental role food and water play in satisfying fundamental human rights, particularly in light of Australia's affirmation of the World Plan on Action of Food Security in '96. There must be public and private sector collaboration in circumstances where the UN have recognised that multi-sector initiatives that respond to country demands have higher instances of long-term implementation and adaptation. And finally, I believe this strategy would enable Australia to be proactive rather than reactive to transitory and emergency food requirements needed during increased instances of natural disasters and man-made emergencies. This approach is reflective of commentary from the UN Secretary-General that food, as we've all learnt today and know and appreciate, is a right for all people that must be realised. And the economic, social and environmental impact and varied externalities must be better assessed and mitigated or leveraged as required. And thirdly, in what would be the very first of its kind in the world, I believe that the long-term oversight and regulation of a national strategy should be overseen and enforced by an independent statutory body, much like ASIO, where a Director General would provide impartial advice to government through a Minister for Food on threats to Australia's food security. We could stop there, but I believe that in order to maintain relevance and real-time updates, the independent advisory board, similar to the one established for the review, should be maintained and used to inform the Director General, whilst an Ambassador for Food Security should also be appointed to play a leading role in international food security advocacy and the provision of additional impartial advice to government. There have been many calls over the past few months for the establishment of a Minister for Food, to which I absolutely agree. However, my view is that a minister should permanently sit within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in circumstances where the issue of food security is and will always be a matter of national interest and is intrinsically linked to all other Commonwealth portfolios. And in what I know is a new concept, but takes inspiration from other recent appointments in climate change and agriculture, I consider that an Ambassador for Food Security should be appointed to reaffirm Australia's commitment to the Rome Declaration and reiterate the Australian Government's commitment to working collaboratively with multiple sectors of government, industry and community groups. Now, whilst I appreciate that my recommendation is in respect of driving change through a national mechanism, it is imperative that state and territory governments are treated with equal importance in this process. This is due to the fact that national policies and legislation and the underlying rule of law in Australia impact the way in which states and territories operate. As a result, if states and territories are not at the table and are not able to contribute to local community knowledge in creating a national mechanism, we will fail to create tangible change. Now, even if a national mechanism is not established, I'm confident that through the commitments you've all made today and through the New South Wales Government, that New South Wales has a unique opportunity to create change. And I'd encourage you to embrace the momentum and lead by example. To conclude, I'll lean into comments made by Craig and Levi today. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to stop trying to drive change by doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Just as we cannot make a cake without having all necessary ingredients working as one, we cannot confront the reality of balancing food production with climate action, affordable food and healthy diets, and stable food supplies with a fair and open trade in Australia without urgently moving from an incremental and siloed approach to instead taking a holistic approach in the recognition that food is a fundamental human right and it is at the very core of every aspect of our day-to-day lives. Now, I've given you a lot of food for thought this afternoon, but I hope it will help inform you in your efforts going forward, particularly in the workshops tomorrow. I'd like to thank the Aboriginal Affairs Department of New South Wales for the opportunity to contribute to this valuable symposium. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.